In May of 1967, a mesmerizingly beautiful song was released. One with the unique ability to automatically grab the full attention of every listener's ear it gained access to, stopping them dead in their tracks, as if under a spell, to listen intently to the hypnotic descending melody of its composition and performance. That song, one of the most successful singles of all time, was A Whiter Shade of Pale by Procol Harum, a piece of music that would become an anthem of sorts for the legendary Summer of Love it was released just before the dawn of. However, putting aside the captivating melody of this great work presents the opportunity to focus in on and give a proper appreciation to its lyrics, or more accurately in this case, the unique style in which they were written. It goes without saying that there is as many interpretations of A Whiter Shade of Pale's meaning as there are people who have attempted to explain it. And this is no surprise, as lyric writer Keith Reid once stated, "I was trying to conjure a mood. I wanted to paint an image of a scene. I wasn't trying to be mysterious with those images. I was trying to be evocative." In other words, the story being told in the lyrics isn't put forward in the typical fashion. That is, it doesn't go from scene A to scene B to scene C in a typical easy-to-follow way. It's told through conjuring up certain images in the listener's mind, and leaving it up to them to interpret those scenes and metaphors based on the mood they put them in during that process. Be that as it may, by the time the lyrics were rolling along, an intention did arise for Keith to tell a certain story through those images. The oldest one of all, actually. The story of a broken-hearted man losing a woman he doesn't want to let go of. Or as Keith tells it, a straightforward girl leaves boy story. And with this key, suddenly the string of seemingly abstract lines we encounter on the lyric sheet start to make sense, and a narrative shows itself. "We skipped the light fandango," our narrator begins, "turned cartwheels across the floor." So, our first image paints a scene of dancing, the fandango being a lively Spanish dance, while the phrase, "tripping the light fantastic," clearly being played on here, also describes the act of dancing. But it's not all fun and games, as our narrator elaborates, "I was feeling kind of seasick, but the crowd called out for more," which paints a picture of discomfort accompanied and amplified by the social pressure to continue through it, reaching a limit but being pushed to continue, as Keith would once describe it. We'll also note the choice of the word seasick here, as it will be the first of many nautical-themed terms used throughout our journey. "The room was humming harder as the ceiling flew away," our narrator continues, driving the feeling of sickness home further. "When we called out for another drink," he then concludes, "the waiter brought a tray." So then, as Keith said, these lines aren't a simple description of events. They're instead a collection of metaphoric images wrapped around emotive evocations, so many interpretations could be garnered from them. But one thing is for sure, as noted earlier, they are centered around unease. The popular interpretation is that our narrator is partied out. He's out on the town, worse for wear and being pressured to keep going. Somewhere we've all been once or twice in our own lives, I'm sure. And while Keith once stated our narrator's sickness doesn't necessarily have to be the result of too much drink, the basis for the title, A Whiter Shade of Pale, did come to him at a party when he overheard a man say to a woman, "You've reached a whiter shade of pale," likely due to that very thing. And if that was the initial inspiration for the song, this verse being centered around a night of heavy drinking does make sense. After all, they ask for another drink, implying they'd already started before this point, and the waiter brings an entire tray, so we can assume they've already earned a reputation of high intake for themselves at whatever establishment they're at, where our narrator is feeling seasick, the room is humming, and the ceiling, to his vision, is appearing to fly away. I mean, to me that seems like the types of things one experiences before praying to the porcelain god. It sounds like the good old spins. But who knows? We could at least presume the idea of partying was in the back of Keith's mind when he came up with these lyrics, or these images, strictly based on the place and time he first found inspiration for writing them. And so it was that later, the chorus so famously begins, as the miller told his tale, that her face at first just ghostly, turned a whiter shade of pale. Now, Though the rest of the song seems to give these lines a very different meaning, here they seem to follow the first verse's theme quite closely. More interesting, though, is the very apparent reference to the Miller's Tale by Chaucer being mentioned here. For those unfamiliar, Geoffrey Chaucer was a 14th century author and poet known to this day for authoring the Canterbury Tales, a collection of stories told from the point of view of pilgrims having a storytelling contest while traveling from London to Canterbury. One of them is told by a character known as the Miller, and the Miller's Tale is the dirtiest of the lot. In fact, at the time it was written, it was probably the crassest piece of English lit ever published. The Miller tells the tale of a student who rents a room from a carpenter and his wife. The wife is very beautiful, and she has many admirers, one in particular named Absalom, who is determined to sleep with her. Meanwhile, the student actually does convince the carpenter's wife to have an affair with him, and concocts a scheme to give them the opportunity. He fakes sick, and when the carpenter comes into his room to check on him, he sees him lying there on his bed staring blankly at the ceiling. Faking a state of ghostly discomfort, he tells the carpenter that he just had a vision of a great flood coming, an apocalypse of sorts, and convinces the carpenter to prepare 3 tubs to suspend from the barn ceiling, one for him, one for the carpenter himself, and one for the carpenter's wife, with an axe in each to cut through the ropes the tubs are hanging from when the great flood comes, thus turning their tubs into makeshift boats to float on top of the water until it subsides. And like a complete idiot, the carpenter believes him and prepares the tubs. The 3 of them get in, and when the carpenter falls asleep, the student and the wife sneak out of their tubs and go to the bedroom to get busy. And when they finish, Absalom, the man determined to sleep with the carpenter's wife, comes to the window and begs her for a kiss. And as a joke, she makes him close his eyes and puts her rear end out the window, which Absalom kisses, leading to a massive laugh from her and the student at his expense. Obviously humiliated, Absalom leaves, but he returns not long after asking for another kiss, a real one this time. The wife says okay, but tells him he has to close his eyes again, which he does. Only she doesn't shove her rear end out the window this time. The student does. Only to realize Absalom has brought a red-hot poker with him for revenge, and he shoves it. Well, you can guess where he shoved it. Writhing in extreme pain, the student starts screaming for water to combat the burning. Meanwhile, the carpenter wakes up in his tub to the sound of someone screaming about water and thinks the flood is underway, so he grabs his axe and starts hacking away at the ropes holding him to the ceiling, only to come crashing down to the floor. And that's basically the entire Miller's Tale, a strange little work of profanity for its time. And there's a few things that we should take note of in relation to A Whiter Shade of Pale. First of all, the chorus, as we noted, has the line, "As the Miller told his tale." Secondly, the first verse contains the line, "As the ceiling flew away," which seems to reference both the ceiling during the student's trance and the ceiling being torn away during the flood. The same verse also has the line, "I was feeling kind of seasick," which can easily be taken as a reference to the flood narrative in the Miller's Tale. Moreover, the song itself, according to its writer, is about a man losing his woman, which is the entire premise of the Miller's Tale. And yet, with all of these connections, with the chorus literally saying, "As the Miller told his tale," Keith Reid had never read the story. In fact, he had no idea what it was about, if he even knew it existed, when he wrote the song. It's hard to even begin to wrap your head around, but Keith has said that that's the case. "I'd never read the Miller's Tale in my life," he'd tell an interviewer. "Maybe that's something that I knew subconsciously, but it certainly wasn't a conscious idea for me to quote from Chaucer, no way." So then, all of the interpretations of A Whiter Shade of Pale's lyrics based on the Miller's Tale miss the mark, and there are plenty of them. All the connections between them are a case of startling coincidence, if you're one who believes in such things. But we'll digress from that line of thought and hop now into the second verse, where the main narrative of the song finally starts to take shape, where our female character breaks it off with our narrator, who explains, "She said, 'There is no reason, and the truth is plain to see.'" So this is an interesting technique being used here. Instead of starting the scene from the beginning, Keith paints his first picture of his second verse with his characters in the midst of the conversation, the part after she's told our narrator that it's over, and after he's asked her why. to which she gives no reason in particular in return, and only points to the obvious fact that the relationship has simply run its course. But our narrator doesn't want to accept this fate. "But I wandered through my playing cards," he tells us, indicating that he was searching for his next move to play before expanding with, "and would not let her be one of 16 Vestal virgins who were leaving for the coast." Now, the image of Vestal virgins leaving for the coast, aside from being another nautical allusion, is a reference to the reputed divine priestesses of ancient Rome. However, here they seem to be representing nothing more than unattached women. In other words, our narrator doesn't want his girl, or at this point his ex-girl, to be another single lady traveling out into the world without him. In fact, he's unable to even accept their breakup to be a reality, which, in hindsight, he admits next by explaining, "And although my eyes were open, they might just as well have been closed." That is, he's experiencing the first of the 5 stages of grief: denial. He's unable to see the truth right in front of his eyes. So then, in a nutshell, this series of metaphoric images work together to paint the single picture of a woman breaking up with a man, and his inability to reverse that decision, and his reluctance to not only understand why, but to accept it as a reality altogether. And considering all of this, it brings a whole new viewpoint to the lines in the chorus. "And so it was that later, as the miller told his tale, that her face at first just ghostly turned a whiter shade of pale." These last lines, the title lines, can now be taken to mean that our narrator is seeing this woman in a different light. She could be turning pale because she feels bad for breaking it off with him. Or they could be taken to mean that his relationship with her has officially died, and his description of her complexion is expressing that death. When the writing was on the wall, meaning when it was clear that they were nearing the end, she appeared ghostly. But when it was officially terminated, she, to him, became an even whiter shade of pale, now representing the corpse of the life that he once knew and cherished, i.e., their relationship. And this line of thought is backed up in the very much unknown 3rd verse of the song. That's right, though the radio and album version of the song only featured the first 2 verses, Keith Reid actually wrote 4. And in the 3rd verse, written in the same abstract style, the 2nd verse's narrative continues on, as our narrator explains. She said, "I'm home on shore leave, though in truth we were at sea. So I took her by the looking glass and forced her to agree, saying, 'You must be the mermaid who took Neptune for a ride.' But she smiled at me so sadly that my anger straightway died." The declaration that our female character is only home on shore leave paints the picture of her stay being only temporary. She's telling our narrator that their relationship was only a fling, a passing fancy, a vacation from real life, something they should have both knew wouldn't last. But he counters her by saying, "No, you're not on the shore, we're at sea," meaning there is a commitment between us, we're on a real journey together, and he forces her to agree with him, to see through the lens that he's looking through. But, in fact, it's him who is finally forced to see the truth, that what he thought was permanent was only temporary. And in realizing this, he blames her for leading him on and letting him down. The sentiment expressed in the next line of, "You must be the mermaid who took Neptune for a ride." Neptune is the Roman god of the sea, our second reference to Roman theology in the poem, while mermaids are mythologized as seductive sirens who steer ships off course and lead them to disaster. It's easy to see that here, our narrator has realized that he's been bamboozled, or more accurately, he's bamboozled himself. It wasn't real. It wasn't permanent. It was, to her, an exercise in capriciousness, nothing more. By calling her a mermaid, our narrator is illustrating his anger with her. He's insulting her by implying she did it all on purpose, as if it was her intention to lead him to disaster. But her tender and sad expression in return to his rebuke immediately works to disarm his anger, leaving only sadness to remain. He realizes it's not her fault. It's his for getting too attached to something that wasn't meant to last. Our last verse, perhaps the most equivocal of them all, then reflects on the situation, beginning with a nod to the opening lines of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, which go, "If music be the food of love, play on, give me excess of it." Keith begins his verse with, "If music be the food of love, then laughter is its queen. And likewise, if behind is in front, then dirt in truth is clean." These lines, at least the first two, harken back to the song's opening, a scene of music, dancing, and good times. However, what seemed to begin as a great night quickly turned into a stomach-churning nightmare for our protagonist. It turned out to be the opposite of how it first appeared, and this seems to be what is being indicated by the next lines, which express contradictions to initial appearances, where behind is actually in front, and dirtiness is actually cleanliness. In a phrase, the world is backwards, his world has been turned upside down. "My mouth by then like cardboard seemed to slip straight through my head," he continues, expressing that there was nothing left to say. "So we crash-dived straightway quickly and attacked the ocean bed." Meaning, in keeping with the nautical theme, their relationship was officially sunk, the ocean floor representing the final resting place of that which has died. Here, our narrator has gone through the 5 stages of grief and finally reaches acceptance. So then, through all of this vast literary referenced poetic imagery, A Whiter Shade of Pale boils down to a simple plotline. It's a breakup song, but it's certainly not your run-of-the-mill type. What makes it so great, at least from the lyrical perspective, is how that age-old story is told, and the unorthodox method used to get there. Though it quickly becomes a tale of girl leaves boy, it certainly doesn't start that way. The first initial visuals in that first verse could have gone anywhere, and us, the listeners, are as much taken for that unknown ride as the lyricist himself was while creating it. As Keith once said, "That's the way I work. An idea, building from a little piece. You could say if you were a painter, a few brush strokes, and you look at it and you go, what is that? What could that be?" So we see that the story wasn't planned. Like life itself, it grew out of what came before it. The difference being that in this case, that story was told through a series of otherworldly images. "I used to like the surrealist painters very much," Keith would reveal while talking about how he approached this piece's writing process. "I'd like the song to feel like a Dali painting looks. Just fantastical things. The colors that someone would use in a picture. You try and come up with that in words." Well, mission accomplished, Keith. From the summer of love to this very day, A Whiter Shade of Pale both entrances and mystifies its listeners from both its first note and its first word to its last. It's the perfect combination of melodic beauty and lyrical allure, wrapped up together in a piece of timeless art which keeps on delivering, and, so long as it exists, always will.